let's try and give you a sense of what has happened and what is likely to happen. Let's first look at that India-US alliance, those pictures that you are seeing of Prime Minister Modi and US President Joe Biden. The India-US alliance, is it the key now to contain China? Is the US wary of India's neutrality on Ukraine? What does this new world order really mean? And will the Biden-Modi chemistry play a role going ahead? These are some of the questions I'll raise right away. Kawal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, joins me. Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, is with us. And Richard Russo, Senior Advisor, Wadhwani Chair in the US-India Policy Studies, again in Washington with us. And Aina Tangan, who's always been very kind to us, joining us, American-Chinese political and economic affairs commentator, is joining me from Beijing. Let me come to you, Kawal Sibal. As you see those images playing out of the two leaders, US President Joe Biden and India's Prime Minister, lots has been on the menu. There's been talk of furthering business relationships. There's been talk of the nuclear reactors that are to be set up in India, taking forward the nuclear agreement. How do you perceive it? What is for you the biggest takeaway from the manner in which Indo-US relations now seem to be at another level?
I think the defining moment in Prime Minister's tenure in terms of relations with the United States was his state visit to the United States, which just took place a few months ago. And there, all the very substantive aspects of our relationship were discussed. Mm-hmm. Whether it is defense relationship, which is centered around the GE414 engine, mm-hmm. Or the Reaper drones, or in general beefing up India's military capacity with US technology wherever is possible in terms of joint development, manufacturing, mm-hmm. what have you. That's one aspect, which is very important. It'll take a lot of time to translate it into concrete programs because lots of issues are involved. Lots of clearances have to be obtained from the United States Congress in particular, because the administrative complexities on the US side and the legislative complexities are pretty difficult. That is one aspect. The other is the whole thing of ICET, mm-hmm. The critical and emerging technologies, on which the initiative was taken by the two national security advisors. The business community is involved, the academic community is involved. So that is going forward going to be very, very critical. As part of this, the semiconductor manufacturing potential in India, mm-hmm. in which the United States companies hopefully would come forward and invest in India. There are some indications that one or two companies are willing to do so. This will be a game changer because India needs to develop independent capacity, and United States seeks to move away from dependence on China. Then there is climate issues, climate financing, energy transition, and renewable energy. So there are a whole lot of
I'm just going to stop you, Mr. Sibal, for a moment, because we are getting news from an American statement that's come out where the two leaders have said our friendship will further global good. The meeting with Prime Minister Modi has been extremely productive, says the US President, and people-to-people linkages and talks on economic linkages have been furthered. Mr. Russo joining me there from Washington. When you hear these words, is this music to your ears that you've got two countries who seem to have forged a stable relationship that cuts across, in the US, the Democratic-Republican divide, and dare I say in India, the divide between Prime Minister Modi, the BJP, and the opposition?
Yeah, it certainly does. Since Prime Minister Modi was elected, and even before that, defense relations have really been integral to what our governments have been trying to do together. In recent years, our shared concern about over-reliance on China for the development of critical and emerging technologies has been able to, I think, provide an important new linkage, which you saw reflected quite substantially in the joint statement after the June summit. But the June summit also reflected, as you rightly point out, an area which I think had really underperformed in the government-to-government lane, which is our commercial relationship. Yeah, the numbers showed that trade and investment were growing, but for the most part, our governments were fighting each other rather than finding ways to cooperate. And we really started to see some breakthroughs in June, resolving 6 WTO disputes and finding other avenues to begin knitting our private sectors together. Obviously, India is one of the fastest growing large economies in the world. The United States still has a healthy growth rate for a large economy. There's so much more that we can do together, particularly manufacturing. And it's good to see that element get on track, too. So very warmly received, expanding the relationship and hitting areas which have been weaknesses before.
How much of that, though, Mr. Russo, is driven by the fact that there is this common desire to contain an expansionist China?
A good measure of it is. I think the first belief of a U.S. administration, if we're going to convince companies to draw down how much they're investing in China, we'd like to see them come back home. But this concept of friendshoring, which sometimes get laughed at a bit, but you've actually seen the Biden administration put real dollars on the table to try to encourage companies, if they're not going to come back to the United States to rebuild manufacturing, will they go to friendly nations, including India? And as Secretary Sybil noticed, our cooperation in climate change, indicative of that would be the $500 million loan we gave to a U.S. company for solar to start putting solar manufacturing in India. So, some of that may be going to U.S. companies, but the jobs that are being created and the climate mitigation steps are going to be resident there in India, which is inherently a good thing for all of our countries. So they're finding those unique ways where both sides will benefit.
Jayan Krishna, we're getting these details that are coming in on the bilateral between the two leaders, both of them saying that the meeting has been productive. Do you see it as simply a building block of what happened in June when the state visit took place, that this is a relationship which is now stabilized, is seen partly by some as containing China, but actually is now operating on multiple levels, not just in terms of a strategic partnership?
Yes, absolutely, Rajdeep. There is a mutuality in the relationship between the US and India now. I think both countries look each other as very, very significant partners in the global backdrop. And, there are a lot of things. The list is so long, but my only worry is the meeting apparently was rather too short. So how much of it got covered in that short meeting, because the president arrived this evening and straight away went to the racecourse road for the meeting. So I think, but some of the important things must have been discussed. I presume there's no official comment as yet that, this multilateral financial institutions reform I'm sure this would have figured in some way or the other. The jet engine deal, where GE has agreed to transfer 80% of the technology to HAL. I think it had to be fast tracked, and also India's foray into semiconductor. We all know that how Foxconn had withdrawn from its earlier commitment, but during the Prime Minister's visit to US in June, there was a commitment from Micron to invest almost $800 million in the assembly and testing facility in India. So I think all these things need to be, fast tracked. I don't think there's any dispute, in terms of African Union's entry into G20. I think that will be a smooth sailing. But I think, there has been some irritants on the visa side, especially, the in-country renewal of H-1B visa. I think that is something where there was an in-principle agreement that happened in June during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US. But, it has to see the light of the day. Space is, again, one area where I think space diplomacy has to, reach the next level of maturity and capability. Both countries, India's recent Chandrayaan success and the solar study mission, both have been successful. And both countries can learn from each other. And especially India can learn a lot from the US. And collaborate in that space. Also, one area which is not very often talked about, but I think it's a huge opportunity for India is the master ship repair agreement. Companies like L&T and all, they have invested in ship repair facility, but the entire world has to leverage these facilities in a big time. If there is a political push, I'm sure at the end of the day, they are business decisions. But a political backing at the highest level would go a long way in India becoming a very, very important center for ship maintenance, repair and maintenance.
Well, we'll come to you on specifics to all of you, but I want to come to Einar Tangen there in Beijing to give us a sense, Mr. Tangen, that we've got this meeting taking place between India and America, bilateral. We've got more bilateral scheduled tomorrow. All of this against the backdrop of the Chinese president not here, the Russian president not here, and the buzz that the world, in a way, in this new world order that is being crafted, there's a sense that an expansionist China remains a concern for a number of countries, particularly in the Western world, who perhaps now see India as a partner in trying to contain an expansionist China. How do you see it from a Chinese viewpoint?
Well, from Beijing's point of view, this is the old colonial way of divide and conquer, set one Asian giant against another. Quite frankly, it's a little disappointing. I mean, I've been listening very carefully. The views have been expressed very well, but everything has been about what's in it for India. You know, the G20, I thought was supposed to be about how to solve the world's problems, which are quite acute at the moment. You have, you know, the WTO, which is non-functional because the U.S. will not allow the appointment of appellate judges, which would allow a final and binding judgment. The U.S. is standing in the way of a complete climate change wording that would help and somehow address the fact that the developed countries promised $100 billion a year have not delivered. Only 10%, and a large part of that 10% has gone to sweetheart deals for, guess what, the countries involved who are supposedly donating this money. You know, India wants to be the voice of the global South, but it hasn't been able to put in any kind of tough language. It's been stymied, in essence, by the U.S. So there has to be a question of, yes, the U.S. and India seem to be getting closer together, but who is really benefiting? The fact that India will get jet engines, I don't know if that necessarily makes up for the fact that it's dividing India from the rest of Asia. In terms of where China stands, I think the BRICS meeting and the BRICS Plus was fairly successful and shows that there is, in fact, a desire, especially among the global South and also Central Asia, to start trying to come together against the former colonial powers and prevent them from once again, you know, using, grabbing resources at low prices.
But you see, Mr. Tanyan, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Sibal, in a moment. You know, we have a word in India, tali do haath se bachti hai. When you clap with both hands. Now, while the Chinese may feel that this is some kind of a ganging up against them, the truth of the matter is, are the Chinese on Ukraine, for example, willing to go along with the growing concern globally that this is a conflict that reflects the manner in which territorial expansionism cannot take place in the 21st century? So, you know, China also has to be seen to be a country that wants to be part of this new world order in a manner that's a rule-based new world order.
Well, that sounds a little bit odd, given that India is benefiting greatly. It's the largest buyer of Russian oil, which is then being refined or just simply shipped to Europe in a circuitous way, benefiting.
Sure, but that's because
India.
it's in our. I'm sorry to intervene. That's because it's in our national
situation.
No,
so
but
I don't.
But
exactly
that's not the same. That's not the same as. That's not the same as the unwillingness, it appears, of China to see what has happened in Ukraine as an act of aggression.
Well, has India?
Okay, that's a good question. Right? Kamal Sibal, you want to respond?
So
you want to respond to what you heard? Mr. Tangan says, look, you're singling out the Chinese. What about the Indians? Are the Indians willing at the G20?
Also, the U.S. The U.S. has doubled its yellow cake order of uranium, while it's telling Europe that they can't buy Russian gas. That seems a little odd. I mean, literally doubling the amount in terms of dollars that they paid. So, I mean, there's a little bit of hypocrisy here.
Is every country, therefore, Kamal Sibal, operating in self-interest? And therefore, at G20, one of the failures, if there is a failure or to evolve a consensus on Ukraine, and that prevents a consensus document, communique from emerging, can we only blame the Chinese and the Russians?
No, I don't think so. You know, we've not been able to get a consensus in the UN system itself, whether the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly. and all the big powers that are present in the United Nations Security Council and are powerful in the UN system are part of the G20 also. So if they couldn't agree in those forums, I can't see them agreeing so easily in this forum. So far as you know, we could not issue a joint statement at the level of the foreign ministers, the finance ministers, the development ministers. Now to expect that at the leadership level, when the President Biden is himself present, he'll agree to a softening of language or will make concessions and then create a storm back home that he has yielded on this issue appears to me to be rather difficult. I don't think we are blaming China for standing in the way of a consensus on language on Ukraine. I think basically...
No, but the U.S. is. But the U.S. is. The U.S. is. And, the fact is, let me take that to Mr. Russo. Mr. Russo, just before the visit, before G20, when asked a question, the U.S. officials, State Department officials seemed to suggest that it was the Chinese who had to take a call whether they wanted to work together with the rest of the G20. Now you've got, as Mr. Tangen says, don't blame us, don't single us out. Every country here is operating on their self-interest.
Well, we are operating on self-interest, and therefore, it is going to be tough during normal times for the G20 to come to strong, concrete recommendations that would result in action in any of our domestic constituencies once it's over. When we talk about trade matters, we have the WTO. When we talk about development assistance, we have the ADB, the World Bank, and other institutions. The G20 is purpose-built for meaningful action, collective action in times of global crisis. And India, luckily, has had a relatively stable period. There's been some fluctuations of energy, but not as bad as the year before India took over. We haven't had a worsening situation of a new COVID wave that was more devastating or something like that. So we can complain about who may or may not have resulted in the G20 not resulting in concrete outcomes, but frankly, it's more purpose-built for serious action when we're in a deeper crisis than we're seeing right now. So I'm fairly comfortable with the fact that ultimately, if things get watered down somewhat, whether it's conversation about climate change, things like that, there's points to blame on all sides, but also they don't have to react to a substantial crisis. So let's just all be thankful for that.
Mr. Tangen, you're shaking your head vigorously. You want to respond?
Well, I would love to hear the developing countries who are suffering under the dual whammy of massive debts, mostly held by Western nations. Also, the continuous rise in the Fed rate, which is pushing their economies down and making them raise their interests. And the fact that you have civil unrest through swaths of Africa. This idea that there is no global crisis going on, that might work for the U.S., but I don't think that it works for the rest of the world. And I doubt anybody agrees with you. You can say it, but it doesn't make it true.
Mr. Russo, there are surely areas of convergence which need to be highlighted rather than look at the areas of divergence. Wouldn't that be a more positive spirit in which all countries need to look at the next couple of days?
If the G20 could get together and solve those challenges, that would be terrific. But what they focus on are bigger issues, systemic financial risk running between countries. We've seen what real crises look like, and I think everything that my colleague brought up before are exactly on point. We've got challenges here domestically, but the G20 is purpose-built for other types of crises, bigger crises.
But the same G20, Mr. Russo, the same G20 was very effective after the 2008 global financial crisis. Now you've got a challenge post-COVID in the post-Ukraine where several countries have suffering deep debt crisis where you need a new multilateral financing system in place. Surely this is an occasion for the G20 again to rise to the occasion like they did in 2008.
I don't know that everybody sees that it's quite the level that it was in 2008, that you don't have systemic risk bleeding from one nation to the other. Mm-hmm. So a lot of countries have their own responsibility. Debt that's held by individual countries can make those arrangements. Again, I'd love to see the G20 work on that, but the real drive for concrete action, I think, is only when things are escalated to a level than they are right now. So I don't know that we're going to have a resolution at this summit on many of the topics that you brought up.
Jan Krishna? Yes, Mr. Tangen, you want to quickly respond again?
Yes, I mean, just let's be clear. Mr. Russo is talking in generalities. The financial crisis was caused by the United States, and the fact is that the reason the G20 cannot agree is because the U.S. does not agree. He references the WTO, but forgets to mention it's the U.S. who is the impediment for the WTO working. So, I mean, I can't believe he's actually saying these things on television.
This is, the last thing we want is conflict even before the sides have met. I will give Mr. Russo a chance to respond in a moment. But Jayan Krishna, you're hearing these conflicting viewpoints. And in a way, when you get to specifics, the problems come. In generalities, the world seems aware of the broad crises, financial and climate change that need to be addressed. But when you get to specifics, there are divisions right out there. As Geeta Mohan was pointing out, when it comes to climate change, India, China, Saudi Arabia, all on the same side, ranged against the Western world. So within the G20, there seem to be fractures at every level. All very well, all the razzmatazz, shaking of hands. The truth is, when you get to specifics, lots of divisions.
So absolutely, Rajdeep, as you mentioned about the climate, as one of the issues, I think the major issue which is pending is who does the funding for financing for climate change. I mean, the countries, developing countries, have been saying that the developed nations have not done enough for climate change. Some time back, there were some commitments made on Paris Accord. Many countries have not met those commitments they had made. If you look at, there was an agreement that the developing countries put together would fund almost $100 billion for climate change. Bulk of that money would go to the developing countries. A very, very small percentage of that has actually seen the light of the day. So I think climate financing is a major issue. Who does it? So it's a what solution? I hope that in the bilateral there was some discussion, and there'll be more discussion tomorrow and the day after. But I think it's a global South versus global North issue, or global South versus the Western world. That issue is still not resolved, and there's a lot more negotiation has to happen. But I personally would believe that this is a very serious issue. There is a climate emergency. We have just seen the hottest months of June, July, August in human history. This is not a crisis which is looming ahead for the next generation, a few years down the line. It is there right in front of us. The temperatures rising. We have seen huge, massive forest fires in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and so on and so forth. So I think this needs a very, very huge commitment.
There are obviously separate fora, and unfortunately, even on climate change, when the G20 met, they couldn't come to an agreement. We'll come to that in a moment. I just want to ask my guests to bear with me for a minute or two, because I want to play a story. All of this is against the backdrop of the summit that starts tomorrow. There is still no consensus, we can tell you, on the much talked about Delhi Declaration that is hoped will become a consensus document at the end of the summit on Sunday. Russia's war in Ukraine and climate change that I just mentioned are major sticking points. Take a look at where we lie at the moment when it comes to the negotiations.
Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. One Earth, one family, one future. This is the mantra that will guide Prime Minister Narendra Modi as he chairs the G20 summit, a gathering of world's top leaders in New Delhi. Prime Minister Modi on Friday posted on X that the group will seek to accelerate progress of Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, Green Development Pact for a Sustainable Future, and strengthen multilateral institutions. Modi stretched on the importance of technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. The G20 will also work to further gender equality and women empowerment and ensure world peace. The Delhi Declaration, the G20 joint statement, is still a work in progress. Russia's war in Ukraine and climate change remain the sticking points. The Western nations are pushing for a mention of Russia's actions in Ukraine, while the Russians and Chinese are blocking it.
G20 is an economic forum it discusses issues of growth and development. However, last year in Bali, there was a feeling that issues of conflict and war have an impact on growth and development.
New Delhi has played down concerns that China, which is represented by its Premier Li Qiang, will play a spoiler, given its strained ties with India.
China is a multilateral player. In multilateral discussions, the issues are very different from bilateral issues. The challenge about any multilateral discussion is that you have to bring consensus across every issue. Every country has a veto power, and therefore we have to bring everybody on board.
The consensus-building efforts will now be led by the heads of state.
We would rather focus on what are the priorities in the G20, of the G20 countries. Our belief is that multilateralism needs to be reinvigorated, it needs to be inclusive, and it also needs to be an important center and a medium for global governance.
India, under Prime Minister Modi, reshaped the G20 by giving the Global South voice on the high table. The African Union, a group of 55 African nations, is all set to get representation in G20. With Geeta Mohan in New Delhi, Bureau Report, India Today.
So let me go around our guests one more time to ask them what is that big thing they would like to see happen in the next 48 hours, which will be seen as a breakthrough. Kamal Sibal, African Union likely to become part of G20, becoming G21, is being seen as a huge positive. Is that something that you believe can be seen, measured as a success of Prime Minister Modi's attempt to make India a leader of the Global South? Will that be a measure of success, or does it require that final communique where all the countries come and resolve those ticklish issues like climate change and Ukraine, or is that expecting too much?
I think the success of G20 hinges very critically on a joint statement, on a leadership declaration. If they fail to issue one, it will actually mean the slow death of the G20. Because if they cannot find a consensus amongst themselves in a restricted group on all the vital issues of the day and commit themselves to resolving the problems that the international community is facing, and they think that one or two specific issues are enough to break the possibility of issuing the joint statement, and I think that will compromise the future of the G20. Okay. As you know already...
Those are strong words. Those are strong words coming from you. You believe that the G20's future itself will be at stake, is it?
Absolutely. And the fact that the African Union will join is definitely a plus. And will give more voice to the Global South, no doubt, and to Africa in particular. That is clear. But this is not going to be the defining success of the G20. It's simply an addition, an additional positive element added to it. But if there is no leadership declaration, then how does the addition of Africa help in smoothing over problems within the G20 and facilitate the issuance of a joint statement?
I take your point. Mr. Russo, is part of the problem that the G20 has become too big. You see, you will add the African Union, there will be celebration that the Global South has a greater voice, but the truth of the matter is many believe that smaller groups, Mr. Tangen just now mentioned BRICS Plus and the efforts there to evolve a consensus that seem to be more effective than a group like the G20 in a multipolar world with no real clear leadership. Who's going to actually bring all these countries together?
Well, it certainly gets harder to get consensus when you have a larger number of members, but it becomes easier when we all agree on a certain set of crises they need to respond to. Not to deny anything that others have said and the wages they all play, but G20, when you've got contagion reaching across borders, the potential for banks to fail, those kind of things don't appear to be on the table, even if we've had a number of bank failures here in the United States of late. So it gets harder to act for sure, but it's easier to act if you can all agree on a set of crises. And right now, I don't think there's something big enough to force the leaders to come to concrete action.
You know, Mr. Tangen, is China using forums like BRICS to weaken G20? Is China more comfortable in forums like G20 where they have a more controlling influence? Your voice, you're on mute, sir.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. The issue here is that the G7, G8, when it was not able to handle the financial crisis of 2008 created in the United States. So they created this G20 to do it. Fast forward to today, it seems, and I would agree with my former colleague, that this is a litmus test on whether the G20 is in fact the entity that can deal with the issues. Since that financial crisis, you've started to see a sharp division between the global South, Central Asia, and the developed nations. How that pans out, we don't know. But if you start thinking about it, you start looking at what 160 countries, which would represent the global South and Central Asia, who have the largest markets, populations, GDP, production, manufacturing. This would be something very interesting, because instead of begging for money to be sent to them from the developed powers, they could, in essence, start putting the cost of global remediation in terms of the environment and also development into the prices of their strategic minerals, especially if they did something like OPEC. Now, obviously, the developed nations would not be happy. So if you asked originally what I would like to see here, I would like to see a strong statement led by India that is, in essence, taking the voice of the global South forward, expressing the need for the WTO to be resurrected and have more, appellate judges appointed so it can actually work, and also climate financing. That has to be addressed, as well as the private debt that is being held by the West, which no one seems to acknowledge.
And where does that leave Ukraine, if I may once again return to what remains the big ticklish issue? Is that to be simply kept aside and say, look, we've got these major issues where we can achieve convergence, whether it's climate financing, whether it's creating a sort of debt relief structure, focus on that. We'll talk about Ukraine on another day. Do you believe that's possible?
No, I don't think so. I think Russia is pretty hardened in that area. It doesn't matter what China says or does. China is trying to make sure that there's a table that all these parties can eventually go to, much the way they have in the Middle East, trying to bring parties who are on opposite sides like Iran and Saudi Arabia. The issue here is all of these issues have to be settled diplomatically. This pipe dream that you can just settle them militarily is leading to needless deaths and no gain for anybody except perhaps a few in the U.S.
So, Jayan Krishna, in conclusion, a lot of excitement in India because this is the biggest event we've had diplomatically in years. India's leadership at one level, and Prime Minister Modi in particular, has made a genuine effort to scale it up, 200 events over 60 cities. So India trying to consciously project itself as a leader of the global South. Do you believe that's worked, or will the next 48 hours decide the success of what we've achieved over the last 12 months?
See, I have a feeling, Rajdeep, there'll be some joint statement, declaration, whether it's a toned-down version of a few things, especially the Russia-Ukraine war and things like that. But, as you rightly said, India took its presidency of G20 very, very seriously with 220 meetings spread over 6 weeks. In the history of G20, from 1999 onwards, never, ever any country has had this nationwide initiative. So I think India's position in the world stage has definitely gone up. Even critics of the Prime Minister would agree to that. And Mr. Modi's, the Prime Minister's domestic clout has also improved in the process, the way, this entire initiative has been projected and the entire razzmatazz, not just in Delhi, but all across the country, I think. And India has emerged as a worthwhile voice of the global South. It is trying to reinforce its position, and rightly so, because who else will do? China will do. China, to my mind, actually doesn't even represent a global South, to that extent, because, if you look at many of their economic indicators, including the per capita income, they're far higher, kind of a thing. So I think it's only reasonable, and I see India getting there slowly but surely as some kind of a worthwhile voice, right. Collective voice for the global, South. And now with the African Union joining in, right, wherein it played a pivotal role, I think it will reinforce that position.
Okay, that's a positive note on which to end what's been a fascinating discussion. Always good to have four articulate voices expressing their views so clearly. And I really appreciate, I've learned a lot in the last 40 minutes. So thank you all for joining me here on this extended roundtable prelude to G20. We'll have plenty more, of course, all through the day.